Well, good evening, dear friends. I'm very glad to welcome you to the sixth lecture of this year Open Lecture Series, organized by Faculty of Architecture by Estonian Academy of Arts, and it's supported by Cultural Endowment of Estonia. It's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, James Taylor Foster. James is Stockholm-based writer, editor, designer, and broadcaster. James is working in the field of architecture, design, agriculture, and technology. He's curator of contemporary architecture and design at ArkDes, which is Sweden's National Center for Architecture and Design. Formerly European editor at large at ArchDaily, the world's most visited architectural platform. He has practiced architecture in the UK and the Netherlands. And 2016, he was co-curated the Nordic Pavilion at the 15th Venice Architecture Biennale. And in 2018, he participated in the central exhibition Freespace at the 16th of Venice Biennale. James has been a visiting critic or lecturer in architecture at the University of Cambridge, the Bartlett UCL, University College Dublin and Architectural Association in London, the CUS, the Strelka Institute, Technical University of Delft, the Bell Arch Institute, and MIT. He sits on the advisory board of the Future Architecture Platform. According to James, architecture is a practice of referring to, mimicking, and communicating. Architects and those who operate in and around the sphere of building environments for people and things hunt and gather in order to absorb and represent. Please join me welcoming James Taylor Foster.
Thank you. I don't know what you were expecting. I'm not Swedish. Maybe that's a good thing, maybe that's a bad thing. I'm British. I think it's important that we lay out citizenships before we begin, because I haven't lived in the UK for a long time, but I speak with a British accent, and if I give a terrible lecture, at least you can fall asleep to a broadcaster's voice. But don't fall asleep, because I'm going to try to articulate exactly what was just described. A position which maybe you're a subscriber to, maybe you're not. And around this sort of chaotically jump between projects, between ideas, and desperately try to keep you awake. That's the fundamental aim of any lecture, I think. This image that we see here is something that you probably recognize. And there's no need to fundamentally explain it. We'll come back to it a bit later on. But you've had a few minutes to absorb it, to look at it, and to understand that when we're talking about this idea of hunting and gathering, we're talking about something very, very primordial. I'm a writer by profession, a curator by extension, an architect by training. I write about all sorts of things, all the way from reviews of exhibitions, all the way to talking about fashion and things like that. I'm basically extremely curious, and I think it's important to state that, because I fundamentally believe, and I didn't realize when I was studying architecture that this would be the case, but I fundamentally believe that architecture is one of the greatest groundings for a fundamentally broad kind of practice, with the kind of skills that you're taught, because you're basically taught how to think more than how to make. You can get very far. Because architects do not build. Provocative statement number one, although there was no response, right? Architects do not build. Architects communicate. And what I mean by that fundamentally is that there are very few architects in this world. And we'll come to one a little bit later on who is the exception to this rule. But there are very few architects who actually build. Architects create drawings. They represent, they talk, they communicate, they articulate worlds through different kinds of means, but they do not build. And I'm a fundamental believer in the fact that display, exhibitionism, which is a slightly odd word, words and speech being very different things, are instruments of architectural practice, fundamental instruments. So this is a talk not really about things that I have done, but they are things that I've been heavily involved in, right? Because it's not all my work. What it represents are relationships, curatorial work. You know, interestingly, the Swedish word curator basically means therapist, which is extremely confusing in a Swedish context. But curator is a Latin word, right, which comes essentially from the root to care. So all curation is, because I think curation is quite a complex thing to understand. I don't think many people really understand. I don't think many curators really understand what they're doing. But if you think about it in that fundamental sense, that it is just simply the act of caring, then it starts to make a lot of sense. Caring about ideas, caring about people, caring about fundamental things like context, and also caring about trust. Because trust is all we have, and trust is one of the most important things that a curator has in its arsenal. So there's basically this idea that I'm going to try and articulate through a series of projects tonight about the mesh network, is that practice is not egocentric. And I don't know about you, but most studies in architecture subconsciously build the ego. Right? You come out of architecture school with this fundamental belief that you are really important, that you are a world builder, that your ideas are very important, and they're not. Like, they're absolutely not. What is important are intense collaborations, are building relationships. And that, I think, is called a mesh network. I got the word mesh network from an episode of Westworld, by the way. Because the other thing that's really important is how everything bleeds into popular culture, how popular culture is so integral to the idea of architecture, because it represents the values of society and it reflects back onto the world. Also, this concept of hunting and gathering doesn't come from me. Like I said, very little comes from me. This actually comes from a really, really wonderful interview that Paola Antonelli, who is a curator at MoMA in New York, had with Jack Self in Real Review 7, a very interesting magazine, in which she's talking about Emilio Ambash. Emilio Ambash was one of the early curators focused in architecture at MoMA. Really, she said he spoke about different types of curation. And in talking about himself, and she also feels this way, he refers to his work as hunting and gathering, as absorbing and reflecting, as finding things out. The way that Paola describes it, which is so beautiful, she says she comes back to her office with her jaws dripping with blood as she's been out to kind of find her prey, because that's kind of what it is like. You've got to seek, you've got to indulge, you've got to find. And I think we all do that, and architecture needs that. But also, when we think about hunting and gathering, I'm also talking, as I said, about these different kinds of disciplinary formats, these different kind of disciplinary modes, like writing, like speech. And maybe unconventionally, I'm going to read to you from a book by a writer called Durga Chubose. Has anybody seen this book? Has anybody read this book? Hands up. No hands. It was published 2 years ago. I really recommend you get this book. Durga Chubose is a really young, fascinating fashion journalist who basically kind of wrote what I would describe as her memoirs at the age of, well, her late 20s. So it sounds kind of ridiculous, but it's very, very, very interesting. And I'm going to read to you to basically explain or try and articulate through an example how important listening is, listening to words that are written, because words on a page are structures, are very carefully articulated, just as the lines of a sketch might be, or the lines of an orthographic drawing. They are designed, and they can conjure amazing images of worlds and spaces. So this is a little piece from a chapter called Since Living Alone. As someone whose central momentum is having connected, similar to the high of having written, my life before living alone was, to exaggerate, one very long practice session. I'd been avoiding myself with such ease that even when an obstacle presented itself, like the pained limits of a friendship that had run its course, my response was to adapt around it the way we circle street construction on our way to the subway without much thought, as if the ball and sockets of our hip joints, anticipating those orange pylons, swerve so as to save our distracted selves from falling into crater-sized holes. Avoidance can be elegant, certainly, because elegance, like restraint, is a spectacle that assuage. Even the word avoidance, smooth as if meant solely for cursive, sleek lines, a speedy, unthinking gesture like one's signature. Edmund White once wrote about Marguerite Duras in the New York Review of Books. Her work was fueled by her obsessive interest in her own story and her knack for improving on the facts with every new version of the same event. In less than 30 words, a tally of 4 hers. I count living alone as, in a manner of speaking, finding interest in my own story, of prospering, of creating a space where I repeat the same actions every day, wetting them, rearranging them, starting from scratch but with variables I can control, or, conversely, eagerly appeal to their chaos. I can approximate what time it is on sunny mornings by glancing at the frontiered window that darkens on the building adjacent to mine, casting a crisp line that cuts the building's sandy yellow brick, lowering notch by notch as 6:15 all of a sudden becomes 7. It takes me 14 steps from my bed to my bookshelves, and 9 steps to walk from my front door to the globe lamp I've propped on a stool under a wall I've half decorated, of which a poster I framed hangs asymmetrically next to nothing more than blank white wall. That globe lamp is the first light I turn on when I return home. For 9 steps when I walk in at night, after shutting my front door and placing my keys on their hook, I navigate the slumbered mauve and moonlit darkness of my space. It welcomes me, the darkness. I think it's a very beautiful piece, because what it explains through writing is that space, architectural space, a room, is not necessarily just walls and floors and windows and objects. A room is relationships. A room is this kind of whirlpool of a context where actually, if we think about a space, we're not thinking necessarily about what color the wall is. We're thinking about how that color makes us feel. We're not necessarily thinking about how beautiful that veneered wood is on the windowsill. We're thinking about an object that's on that and what that object means. We're talking about rituals, and we're talking about patterns of life. That's really important as we move on, because like was described, I'm now a curator at ArkDes, which is the Swedish Center for Architecture and Design. Has anyone been there? Does anyone want to be there? This is an interactive lecture. Does anybody want to go there? It's like, you know, it's an amazing thing. Architecture museums are quite rare as far as they go. Architecture curators are quite rare as far as they go. This building is designed by Rafael Maneo. It's one of the few public buildings designed by, after a competition designed by a foreign architect in Stockholm. It's a spectacular series of spaces. And in there, I'm going to talk a little bit about projects that I've done. But first, as I said, diving from thing to thing, we're going to talk about attention. Because right now, I hope I have your attention. When I was reading that piece, I hope I had your attention. Attention is a resource. And exhibitions are essentially rooms of attention, regimes of attention. They require you to build a relationship with objects. And for curatorial work, it requires to understand how those relationships can be formed. And I have been thinking about attention for quite a long time, ever since I was working at ArchDaily. There was a piece written in the December 1997 issue of Wired magazine, back when Wired magazine was a print thing. You know, like actually you could hold it. Now it's a little bit more ephemeral, although I think it's still in print. I haven't seen a print version of Wired in a very long time. And this article came out at a very, very crucial moment in the history of humanity. It came out at a moment when the World Wide Web was starting to become accessible and widely used. And the fundamental basis of society is currency, is economy. And I would argue that we are in a situation completely now in which we have to add another currency to all the currencies of the world, and that is attention. Attention is a commodifiable currency. It can't necessarily be bought and sold, but what's unique about it, like Bitcoin, is that there's a certain amount of it. There can be no more, there can be no less after a period of time. And in that December 1997 issue of Wired, Michael Goldhaber, who was a phenomenal theoretical physicist turned intellectual, said, and you've got to bear in mind this is 1997, the economy of attention, not information, is the natural economy of cyberspace. Cyberspace kind of seems like quite an odd word now, but of course what he's talking about is the internet. He continued to say and explain that the total amount of attention per capita is strictly limited. What one person gets, someone else is necessarily denied. The more minds, the more attention, but also the more who might want attention. He said, ultimately, and rather prophetically, that for better or for worse, the attention economy will prevail. And I imagine everybody in this room is deeply embedded in what he was articulating back then, the attention economy. From very, very simple things like when your phone makes a noise and Tinder pops up and says, you've got a match. You look at the phone, right? When someone texts you, you look at the phone. That is a fundamental trick of the attention economy, and it's built in, it's designed. It's a designed thing, right? And that's really, really important, I think, to understand. This is now a couple of years old, this image. One of the most terrifying images I've ever seen come out of Silicon Valley, in which Apple launched the iPhone 10, iPhone X. And in it, it has a facial recognition thing, right? It can map your face with a dot projection. It can mimic, and of course, like one of the most useless functions of this is these animojis, which I don't think anybody uses, and why would you? Sorry if you do. In this moment, something very, very interesting happened. For the first time in technology, a piece of technology requires attention. So to unlock an iPhone 10, you can't just look at the screen or look slightly to the left of the screen. You have to look at the top half of the phone. Only then will it recognize you and unlock the phone, right? So the idea of attention being fundamentally built into designed pieces of hardware has already happened. It starts to enter into linguistic channels. It starts to enter into vocabularies. The idea of like Netflix and chill. You want to Netflix and chill? What are you doing tonight? Netflix and chill? Right? This is kind of like a ridiculous phrase, which is obviously highly associated to a relatively new company, which really describes a ritual. It describes an activity. It describes a human relationship. But this comes from something very, very simple. I mean, this is not new. Does anybody recognize this? You've got mail. The first tech rom-com in Hollywood history, in which essentially the idea of email as a communicative device was given this kind of Hollywood sheen. You know, it was made real. It was made aspirational for a start, and you can really start to track now, at a moment of like relative hindsight, how these technologies, how they infiltrate popular culture, and how they ultimately infiltrate our lives. But you know, what I'm saying is that this is not new. Museums have always been regimes of attention. Exhibitions have always been regimes of attention. And it's really crucial to understand that as we're in this very, very strange moment now, where if we take this video that Netflix published earlier this year, entitled Meet the Binge Racers, we start to understand that we are products, right? We are real products of attention. The CEO of Netflix has said something very interesting. He said the final frontier for us is very hard to achieve, but we will achieve it. He said Netflix's greatest competition is Facebook for their video network, is YouTube, and is sleep. If they can crack sleep, if they can keep you awake binge watching a TV series on Netflix, they win. They win the game. And of course, it's extremely hard to resist. If we look at front page of the New York Times from 1900 and the front page of the New York Times from 2000, we see like a fundamental difference now. What do we see? What do we see? Interactivity. We see pictures, right? And this is a precursor to something really, really important to recognize on the internet, right? Is it is image-driven. I'm not saying an image-driven internet is a bad thing, but it's something to understand and it's something to be able to reflect upon. Because when something is image-driven, something is necessarily removed. And that is, in this case, words, which represent something a bit larger, potentially. It represents depth. It represents insight. And I think that we're in a moment, literally this year, actually, there have been some serious moves around the world in terms of a general self-conscious among populations that we're starting to recognize what the economy of attention is and how we can potentially battle it. But it's hard to, and in this context, it goes even into the architectural sphere. Does anybody recognize this? It's a trick question, so. This is an image from a casino in Las Vegas, the Venetian, to be precise, which I went to for the first time and only time a year ago, after I'd been at Burning Man. So going to Las Vegas after Burning Man was a bit of a letdown, actually. I was like, well, what's this? There were way more lights over there. But I spent an entire evening in this place, and of course this is what it looks like from the outside. It's rather disconcerting when you place these two images together. And I was in there for hours. Hours and hours and hours and hours and hours. I was like, why have I been in here for hours? And I looked at this plan. There's no plans in the Venetian, like there are in no Las Vegas casinos, because they don't want you to escape. They don't want you to know how to escape. You should look at the fire plans. They're so confusing that I think if there was a fire alarm, you just follow the herd. You just all move in some direction and hope you're going to get out, because they are labyrinths. They are absolute labyrinths. One of the things that you find in these casinos, and if I'm now making a connection, by the way, between exhibitions and casinos, which is slightly unconventional, as regimes of attention. What they want you to do is sit on the slot machines or the poker tables for as long as possible, and they want you to lose track of time. And there's one architect who basically has designed all of the Las Vegas casinos, who is very unknown, and doesn't really have a practice, but he worked out a method of keeping people in place. And it's not about necessarily where you put the walls or the doors, it's also where you place the objects, how you build sight lines. So if you're at a slot machine, you won't be able to see a restaurant within direct eyesight. Right? There are restaurants because, you have to eat to survive. They want you to be able to survive in the casino because they want you to stay, but you can't, nothing is there to distract your attention from the fact that you're on the slot machine. What you can see within 5 seconds walk of wherever you are is an ATM, because they really want you to take that cash out and put it in the slot machine. I mean, it's like these weird cyclical patterns happen inside. They obviously don't want you to get out, so they create these impressive environments which along the way, when you get out of the actual gaming halls, start to create moments of intense attention. They start to have things which pull you in multiple directions. Every time you take 3 steps forward to get out, something takes you 5 steps back. So to actually leave these environments is quite a challenge. And it demonstrates the singular power of orchestrated space to do that. Attention is literally the only resource that we have that we can control, and that no one can take away from us, necessarily. But we have to learn how to control it. And, if I'm going to make a simple point, well, this is a slot machine. If I'm going to make a simple point about, let's say, the shift that I have taken over the last year and a half within the architectural sphere between being a part of running one of the world's biggest websites about architecture, ArchDaily, into a position where I'm in a museum, it's almost like a kind of 180 turn, is really down to the question of ethics and attention. How 2 different worlds can deal with attention in different ways. Because the structure of Web 2.0, the structure of the internet as we know it, is built on fundamentally flawed foundations. Right? It requires attention to be sold, it requires attention to be consumed in order for it to operate, in order for it to make money. And in an institution, like a museum, suddenly you're not beholden to those anymore, right? You're not beholden to how many people pass through the doors, necessarily. You're not beholden to tracking and data metrics. But you can talk about exactly the same thing from different positions. So I'm going to talk, and I don't want to talk on too long because hopefully we'll have a bit of a conversation afterwards, but I'm going to go through basically some projects. With this as a kind of background, this idea of attention and these thoughts, 3 projects that have happened recently. One is a building, and 3 are exhibitions. Very, very different in many different ways, dealing with very different questions. So this is the kind of whirlwind we're about to go on, and I will sort of race through it as elegantly as possible. To reiterate, right, is that all of this that I'm showing is not like my work. Like, I mean, I can't claim responsibility for it in the sense that curatorial work is also about trying to emphasize things which should be emphasized, whether that be people or ideas or objects. Of course, I've curated these things, I've been involved, but it's, you know, I just want to make that very clear because, you know, in architectural lecture series, often you have people standing here who kind of claiming everything is theirs when actually everything is a team effort, right, mostly. The first thing is the Nordic Pavilion. The Nordic Pavilion in the Venice Biennale. Has anyone been to the Venice Biennale? Has anyone been to Venice? Does anyone know this building? Yes, whispers among the audience. Well, this is, hands down, the most important building in Europe. It is one of the most beautiful buildings that I've ever experienced. And of course, that poses a phenomenal challenge when you're trying to put an exhibition in a building so beautiful that most of the people who go, especially architects that go to the Architecture Biennale, don't actually want to see anything in there. They just want to see the building. They're just kind of like, why do you always fill it with an exhibition? I just want to look and gaze at the purity of this space. And it is, it's pure, and it represents something very, very important, like all the pavilions in the Giardini and the Biennale do. It's a very anachronistic model to have national pavilions, but Venice is stuck with it, so everyone tries their best to deal with it. All the pavilions in Venice represent, to a certain degree, the ones that are built by nations as kind of these extraterritorial embassies, are built to represent the ideals of a country, no? So, when Svea Fem, who's a Norwegian architect, after a competition between Norway, Finland, and Sweden, of which the Nordic Pavilion represents, all 3 countries, was selected to design this building, he came with a very specific approach. One was he wanted to represent this idea of Nordic openness, of transparency, of tolerance. And he also wanted to represent the ideals of Nordic architecture of the 60s, which was a profound connection to nature. So he said, I'm going to excavate out of the Giardini, and I'm going to, whatever trees are there, the trees will remain, and the building will be wrapped around the trees. So this image by Walker, Eriksson, Lindman is a beautiful one because we see something that's really been quite a famous part of this building, which is this tree that runs up through this amazing moment in the building, this kind of crescendo corner, where, according to Fern, he was walking down through Piazza San Marco. He looked at the corner of the Piazza Ducali, of the Doge's palace, and this very famous corner with Adam and Eve doing something slightly erotic. And he said, this is a corner. This is an amazing corner. I'm going to translate this corner into my building. And this was his translation. But it was also a very efficient tool for keeping this enormous and quite old plane tree in sight. It's a stunning moment in a project. And when myself and Eva Basulto came to curate this pavilion in 2016, there was a major issue. One is that this tree had been chopped down a month before we arrived, because there is a disease running through the trees of Venice. I say it like it's a secret, I don't think it is. There's a disease running through the trees of Venice, and some of them are having to be destroyed. Of all the trees to be taken down, it was very unfortunate that it was this one. But of course, by the fact that it was no longer there, it represented a kind of void, a moment of emptiness. And that's something that we were particularly interested in dealing with. Because when you look at this building, you see, again, like I said, something that's sort of impossible to approach, impossible to attack. And when you look at exhibitions that have been in the Nordic Pavilion, in the Architecture Biennale, not necessarily the Art Biennale, because artists are much more free and liberated from the weight of architecture and its history, you see rather delicate, in the history you see rather delicate, rather sensitive exhibitions in which a plinth is placed in a corner and no one touches the walls and no one touches the floor, because there has to be a reverence or a respect for the architecture that the exhibition is inhabiting. Now, of course, this is super interesting, because if I were to give a very, very brief rundown, and based on the fact that when I did this, I was not in Stockholm, I was not in this position, I was in other places, right? I had to basically have a crash course in trying to understand Nordic culture and Nordic society. And big questions about Nordic architecture, where when we looked at the project archive in ArchDaily, we saw very, very few projects being submitted by architects from the Nordic countries. And when we looked at those projects, we saw very, very clear threads between the projects. Super interesting. And we said, what we need to do as outsiders, as the first foreigners to be dealing with this space in an architecture biennale, is try to take advantage of this position and look at things in a way which maybe it's hard to look at from within. So we did something which was very, very, very controversial, which was hide the trees. Cover the 3 sacred trees of the Nordic Pavilion with a monstrous pyramid. But it's not as monstrous as maybe it was made out to be at the time, because we had a very clear thought about what this represents. We worked with Maj Arkitekter, based in Stockholm, to create a structure which actually started to deal with the space, as a place for relationships and interactions, as a place in which a new context could be built. Because one of the observations that we made at that time was that there is a problem with architecture in the Nordic region, in the sense that the legacy or the history of the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s is so strong. Figures like Gunnar Asplund, Sigit Leverets, the functionalist movement, all the way back to the Stockholm exhibition of 1930, are very, very important moments. And it's hard to get away from that. It's hard for contemporary architecture to fully leave that. So we said, you don't have to depart completely, but you have to understand how to respect a legacy and then occupy it. Because you have to be able to occupy legacies in order to do anything new. So we said, what we'll do is we'll just take this building and we'll just occupy it. And we'll respect it as much as we can. And when you actually look at this structure, it was built from Swedish pine, for a start. The same wood that was used to cast the board-mark concrete of the pavilion. The concrete, by the way, has crushed Carrara marble, very fine Carrara marble in it, which is why it has this kind of strange white, yellow, glinting color. It's absolutely spectacular. We also followed the measurements of the treads and risers of Fenn's existing staircase. As you can see in this photograph here, it was an exact mimic of that. So essentially what we did was take the architectural tectonics of the space and do something slightly new. Slightly new. It could have been a lot more dramatic, but we're dealing with diplomatic nightmares where you've got 3 countries invested in a space like this. We played with this idea of openness, right? Because the doors of the Nordic Pavilion are actually later additions. They were also made by Sverfem, but they were not originally in place. They were added there because over time, this idea of complete transparency clashed with the realities of the world, which is that people steal things. And so you can't put paintings, as they were in the early days of the Art Biennale, in a completely empty space. So he designed these things, which creates these rather strange mirrors and reflections. And the exhibition was ultimately called In Therapy, which no one really got, to be honest, at the time. But that's why when you see this, an exhibition should be able to, as a spatial sequence, should be able to unfold at different levels, right? I think, especially in the context of the Venice Architecture Biennale of the Giardini, where people, again, because mainly architects build these things, have a kind of phenomenal ego, where they think, well, if I'm doing an exhibition in the Giardini, mine will be the best, and everyone will come and spend half an hour in my exhibition. people walk into the Giardini. If you've been to the Biennale, you will have experienced this. You walk in and you think, okay, immediately I'm overwhelmed. There's so much to see. I've got literally 5 hours because I've got a really good restaurant I want to go to later, and there's also Spritz at 6. And then you sort of rush around. And like, if you spend more than a minute in an exhibition, that's already a good thing. So an exhibition, as far as I see it, should be able to unfold. It should be able to present its idea very clearly and very accessibly. And then it has to be able to unfold for people who want to go in deeper. And the Nordic Pavilion, being in the very center of the Giardini and having these two openings towards this kind of piazza and the Viale Trento, which is the street that runs up to the British Pavilion, should also be able to make the most of this kind of interactivity between the space. It should be an open space. So we had what we called these rooms without walls, which had chaises long in them and Persian carpets, kind of Kafkaesque or Freudian-esque spaces of reflection, in which this idea of in therapy, of this question of like, you know, if you go to a therapist and you're having some serious problems, what the therapist might first ask you about is like your relationship with your parents or your relationship with your grandparents. And what we were asking architects to say is like, well, what is your relationship with people from the functionalist movement, from the 1930s? How do you see that? How can you possibly understand that in order to occupy it? That was the kind of intention behind this. And then on the pyramid itself, on this ziggurat, you had a series you had basically an unfolded book, which started to articulate a survey of architecture built in the last 7 years, to try to sort of ask people visiting to take a position. Because the other thing, as maybe will become clearer as I move on, is that exhibitions, as far as I'm concerned, should not be didactic. They should not say this is how you should think about the world. They should provide the tools by which you can take your own position. That's really fundamental, I think. The other thing which this structure did was something that took a lot of fighting with different people from government institutions to basically to allow people, for the first time, visitors, to actually inhabit the beams, the concrete beams of this building, to be able to walk up into the roof and start to see the building from a new angle, right? Not from below, where you're like, oh, yep, that's that, see it, wow. With some kind of a holy reverence, but to be able to occupy it in a different way itself, which was super fun. I don't think it will ever happen again. It was a health and safety nightmare. But the other thing that this allowed for is the entire space to become amphitheatrical, right? To become a kind of stage set. Because what actually putting a massive four-sided pyramid into the space did was divide this building for the first time in a very long time into different spaces, to take away that kind of clean sweep, but also allow for moments like this to take place. And the other important thing about an exhibition to bear in mind is that exhibitions are temporary, exhibitions are transient, and that's their greatest advantage. In fact, some of the most famous exhibitions in history were exhibitions that very few people went to, were exhibitions that were only on for a week, and then start to build this kind of legacy, they start to build this kind of discourse around which spreads through word of mouth. You know, an exhibition doesn't have to be on for a hilariously long time in order for it to have an impact. Sometimes the shorter, the better. Now, of course, the Biennale is on for 6 months, but after the vernissage, after the opening days, an architect based in the UK called Gabor Galov on the plane home drew this sketch, which is so interesting to me because what this sketch represents, a sketch from memory, is what he remembers and what he doesn't remember, right? So what you see here is, I'm going to try and use, area. What you see here is a wall that doesn't exist. What you see here is, I think, a scale. Also there are 2 layers of lamella on the building. He somehow remembers the tree. He remembers a pyramid. Crucially, he remembers people on that pyramid. The focus is people also inside the beams, right? So from objects like this, from drawings like this, you can start to discern what actually makes an exhibition memorable, right? And that is experience. That is spatial experience. And if I stand here and tell you that exhibition making is a fully validated form of architecture, you may disagree, but I see it like that, right? I see it as a really important facet of architecture. You're building experiences. Also, fascinatingly enough, Neil Barrett, who is a fashion house in in Milan decided they were going to shoot one of their series in the pavilion that year. And this was some of the results. I just put this in as kind of a joke because they called the fashion lines called modernist lines, which made me realize that they didn't actually care or look at the exhibition. They were more interested in the building. But that's a battle that will be ongoing for many years to come. Now, jumping to something more recent, and at the other side of Europe, is a project, a building, a machine for exhibitions, an infrastructure for exhibitions, which has been built at ArkDes in Stockholm this year, which forms part of the sort of new direction that we're all taking at ArkDes. We ran a competition late 2017, early 2018, for architects in Sweden to propose to us a design for a new studio gallery inside the museum. A space which really is crucial in the sense that allows people who are emerging, right? So people who are kind of practitioners in architecture, in design, people who are thinkers, theoreticians all over the place, using design also in its broadest sense, design encompassing technology, to come in, plant a flag, stake a claim, create something that ferments discourse, create exhibitions that are on for a very short amount of time. And we said, we need a piece of architecture to do this. And architecture museums should build architecture. Aside from the idea of exhibitions, it should build buildings. We're fortunate enough to have the space to do so. We are in, this is an updated collage from Delin Brackgård, architect who won the competition. We have two enormous exhibition halls. I think some of the biggest exhibition environments maybe an architectural design museum has in Europe, which were heritage buildings, formerly exercise halls for the Swedish Navy. People running up and down, I don't know, rowing and getting ready for the war that never really came because Sweden's neutral. Underneath the boards, there are tracks where there were boats, which meant that there was a very complex task for Delin Brackgård to create a building that couldn't have foundations and that had to sit on very specific pin load points. But also the brief from our side was also quite open. We said what we're looking for is a space which on the inside is fairly conventional, which has this kind of white cube aesthetic, because we believe, anyway, that the white cube is successful for a reason. The white cube is successful because it works as an environment, as a blank canvas. But there has to be an architectural gesture. And their response to that was very intelligent. And when we are now using this space, and I'll take you through an exhibition that we've just closed in there, you see that what they were requiring by creating this processional ramp, which runs around the outside of the building, this is it, by the way, as a photograph, by creating this processional ramp that runs around, it suddenly makes the exterior of the building an exhibitable environment as much as the interior. And it also means that everything inside is seen from 3 points in space. They are seen from the ground, they're seen from this mezzanine, there's a staircase just in this thickened wall, and then from the top looking down into the space, which is very unique. There are not many exhibition environments in the world which demand that much. This Oculus also, to me, says something very interesting about the state of contemporary architecture in Sweden. It would be too much to say that postmodernism didn't happen in Sweden, but it didn't happen to the same extent that it happened in other parts of Europe. And it's now resurging, as it is across the world, as a kind of interesting period to understand and reflect and absorb and collect and hunt and gather from. And to me, I see the architectural gesture here as being fundamentally sort of postmodern in one of the simplest ways of describing that. Very beautiful space inside, which is extremely demanding as well, but has a kind of industrial quality about it. A quality which is on the one hand very open, on the other hand very prescribed. You can see how it sits inside the museum. These are the two exhibition halls of which Rafael Meneo wrapped around the architect ArkDes as a space, and also Moderna Museet, which is Sweden's Museum of Modern Art. And when you look at this in plan, you see a kind of gesture which Kieran Long, the director of ArkDes, describes as a move to densify the museum rather than expand. When you look at museums all over the world, which are fundamentally public spaces, right, on the most part. This is absolutely a public space in Sweden, just the same as any square in the city would be. There's often this kind of ambition to expand and build new things, and we said, what if we go inwards? What if we build something, a new knot inside the center of the museum? And that's what Dale Bragwood responded to. You can see here the front of the exhibition hall with a wonderful artwork for one of our current headline exhibitions, Public Luxury, designed by Åsa Jungelius, which starts to reopen up the museum onto the public space of the island, which is all owned by the Swedish Heritage Building Board. And really, if you look back at this Åsa Jungelius' piece and this entrance is here, you start to see a whole new sequence of environments be built. This is the main lobby. This boxen is a densifier and a condenser, and a really important space for thinking about contemporary architecture. The ramp is, these are kind of strange photos because there's nobody on them, but you get a sense of the quality, and you get a sense of how you move around this space. And now I'm going to take you through really one of the first important exhibitions inside the space to show you, I think, how radical you can be when you invite architects to create architecture within a piece of new architecture. Space Popular. Has anyone heard of Space Popular? One of the most important, yes, one of the most important architecture practices operating today, and largely unknown for now. Space Popular, Frederick Helbert and Lara Lesmis have been running a unit at the Architectural Association in London for a few years, Intermediate 1. And they are very skilled thinkers, very skilled architects and designers, very skilled educators, operating with this idea of virtual reality. Now, okay, don't reel at me, the idea, because sometimes you say virtual reality and people go, oh, God, not virtual reality again. We're so over virtual reality. Right? We're at the start of something really important with virtual reality in the sphere of architecture. And I'm going to try to explain to you what value in the virtual tried to express. Now, when I talk about curatorial work as an exercise in relationships, context, and trust, the first conversations are really, really important. And one of the first conversations that we had about this was actually reading a book together, a book written in 1935 by Stanley Weinbaum called Pygmalion Spectacles. This is a rather strange illustration or diagrammatic illustration of Pygmalion spectacles, which I discovered somewhere and I have no source for. But in 1935, virtual reality as a concept was created with such precision that it's almost remarkable. You know, sometimes you read something from the old days and you think, how did they know? How could they possibly have known this, have prophesized this? And to give you a very, very brief summary, because I think you should all read it, it's a very short book, Pygmalion Spectacles is based in New York. It centers around, essentially, an apartment on Central Park, in which a rather strange professor, who is described as like a goblin-like individual, convinces a rather mundane and boring man who's at a party to come to his apartment. I mean, the story could go either way, but he basically says, put on these spectacles. And into the spectacles, he poured a liquid, which he describes as liquid positive. And through that, this protagonist, this rather boring man from Chicago who works for the Board of Trade, is taken into a world, and he meets someone called Galatia, and a whole series of things happen until he's finally brought back out. And the way that Weinbaum described a virtual reality is completely fascinating, because he described it in a sense that it's not about space, it's not about narrative necessarily, it's about perception. So one of the fundamental arguments behind Space Popular's exhibition here is that humans, architects, who are often humans, are going to have to become cognitive scientists in order to deal with the question of virtual reality. And these 10 propositions for a virtual architecture that were created by Space Popular, which I will read to you in sequence like a manifesto, are central to all the underpinning ideas of where we are now and where we're going to be as citizens of virtual worlds. They argue that virtual content will radically alter the value of architecture. Values will be both gained and lost in the transition to the virtual. Virtual worlds will then intensify our interest and appreciation of physical environments. Architecture will therefore be appreciated by the spatial experience it provides. Spatial experiences will become increasingly specific and tailored to its dwellers. Then planetary scale virtual worlds will start to coexist with their physical counterparts. Peripheral attention will broaden from objects and faces to facades and streets. Virtual craftsmanship will gain appreciation as virtual worlds become the norm. Social appreciation, or you could say social media, will gain appreciation as virtual worlds become the norm. Social media will manifest visually as embellishments to our attire and our environments, and then, crucially, attire and architecture will blend into a continuous version of the self. There's a lot of things said in there, which I'll try and take us through. Within Boxen, Space Popular created 6 environments, because one of the main arguments behind this exhibition is to say, as many people believe, virtual architecture will replace the physical world. No, virtual architecture will augment the physical world. It will embellish, it will enhance the physical world. It's going to happen. And I'll explain why in a second. But they basically said, we are going to create 6 environments that are rooted in Stockholm. Because I don't know if, does anybody have a VR headset at home that they're in for more than an hour a day? One. It's a very interesting person at the back there who answers positively to all. This is happening, right? A virtual reality headset right now costs €1,000, and then you need a €30,000 computer, a €3,000 computer to make it work, and then you have blah, blah, blah. Next year, Facebook, Oculus will release the Oculus Quest, which will put all the sensors, all the hardware into the device, and it's going to be €200. So we're at a moment now, as a kind of like underpinning backbone, where we have to understand that this technology is becoming widely available and widely accessible. So the question of whether architects engage with it or not is not an option. Architects are going to have to decide whether or not to engage with it, because if they don't, there's going to be no use. I mean, this world does not, if you've ever played The Sims or played Minecraft, you'll understand that you don't need to be an architect to create livable environments in virtual worlds. So these 6 environments, based in places in Stockholm, as I said, are there because Space Popular believe that the most immersive virtual environments are ones that are rooted in places that you recognize. Sometimes that can be a totem, sometimes that can be the idea of a reference of a place. So they went and hunted and gathered around Stockholm, and they found these environments, which they started to rebuild. This is a 2D surface, a fabric built as a 3D model in gaming engines, not in Rhino, not in any kind of BIM software, because it's ridiculous that architects use BIM software. Like, BIM software is completely inhibiting. You should try Unreal. You should try software that actually renders in real time and allows you to see spaces in real time. This is what Space Popular teach at the Architectural Association. The gaming world are about 10 years ahead in terms of software than architects and designers are. So these were created as 3D models and then printed on 2D fabrics, partly because Space Popular argue that the first thing to transfer between a physical and a virtual architecture is that of surface. In virtual worlds, surface, is simply light and color, right? It just exists as this kind of rather invisible thing, which manifests itself 3-dimensionally, because surface is a site for depth. So here we see a kind of reinterpretation or translation of the Golden Hall at Stockholm City Hall, designed by Ragnar Östberger's Nordic classicism. A spectacular building, semi-public, totally civic space in which Nordic mythology and Swedish royalty are printed, placed in gold mosaic. And I said, well, in a virtually augmented city, in which we have an interface between what's physical and what exists and what is not, what would we see? We would see potentially the Wi-Fi symbol becoming an important marker of our time, the Wikipedia logo. Does anybody recognize that divine symbol? You're all very sophisticated, because that is from Candy Crush. If you play it a lot, you get a divine. You know, these are like the fundamental references of our moment, they argue. Also, when we go into the idea of the home, the typical apartment in Stockholm, they have started to visualize, we could see the visualizations of Wi-Fi. We could start to see that the most private space we have starts to become the most public. They already are to a certain degree, but we will start to see that as visualizations. This is a subway station in central Stockholm, Östermalmstorg, in which Siri Deckert, when she was 85, one of Sweden's most controversial and important artists, created a Bettergrave artwork. I don't know if you know Bettergrave, where you have to sandblast the concrete. I mean, there's photos of her 85 sandblasting into the, she was extremely committed and very wonderful individual. This is a part of the subway station when she highlights who she deemed to be the 5 most important women in history. Simone de Beauvoir, Sappho, Hypatia, Virginia Woolf, and Hypatia. And in this context, Space Popular said, well, what if public artwork becomes site for activism? What would happen then? Suddenly these figures start to 3-dimensionalize. Suddenly we start to see activist statements that can be present for seconds, all the way to hours, all the way to days. Me Too, net neutrality, decentralized web, GDPR. And the exhibition itself, these are photographs from the exhibition, you start to see how it was presented as a series of surfaces. Fabric surfaces on scaffolding structures and an enormous carpet. This enormous carpet acted as a diagram. So here you see what you see on the ground there. I mean, it's one of the, you should have seen the faces of the people at the printing shop. And we're like, what are we doing? Well, how are you all right? But it's an immense thing which starts to actually act as a diagram or a rubric for understanding the different levels of virtuality. The further something is away from the center, from this vortex, the more representational it is, the more relationship it has to the real world. The closer it gets, the more augmented it gets. At the very center of this carpet sat a single virtual reality headset. And inside that virtual reality headset, which was this kind of portal or threshold into the virtual layer of Boxen, the virtual layer of the exhibition, suddenly you saw these 2-dimensional surfaces become sites for depth. And this all existed in a platform called Sansar. Sansar is created by the people who made Second Life, which was one of the first social virtual reality platforms, which meant that when you went into this space, you had an avatar. And there was a microphone on the headset, which meant that anybody, and you can still visit this space, Sansar is free if you have a PC. It doesn't work on Mac. You could go into the space in the exhibition and you would see other avatars come in and you could communicate with them. So it's also the second exhibition, I think, in the history of institutions, the first one being the Smithsonian, to create an exhibition which has dual layers and exists in a social VR world. The exhibition itself was like walking into an epileptic fit in the most positive and beautiful sense. And pieces of furniture, very simple IKEA furniture, were added all in black to create a sense of scale and 3-dimensionality. This is Frederick and Lara, highly intelligent people who live their ideals about architecture through their clothes. I mean, amazing. Hopefully they will come here at some point. And now for something completely different. And I will keep this fairly brief. Does anybody recognize these 2 images? Sigurd Leverets. We're really going from one extreme to the other here. Space Popular against Sigurd Leverets is one of the most poetic correspondences I could possibly think of. This is, on the left, I will take you through who Sigurd Leverets is if you don't know who he is. But on the image of that is Sigurd Leverets' last studio. He was an architect. That's important to know. His last studio in Lund, when he was getting very old. And on the right, we see an image of his last built project, which is a flower kiosk in Malmö. We'll come back to these images. Sigurd Leverets is unquestionably, I think, one of Sweden's most interesting and probably most important architects. He was born in 1885, and he died in 75 in Lund. And he is a fairly iconic figure. Has anybody heard of Sigurd? Does anybody know Sigurd Leverets? That's more hands, exactly, because Sigit Leverets is undergoing a revival right now, quite a significant revival, in which if I go to schools in Switzerland, in London, in North America, I haven't been in Japan, but I hear that it's true also in Japan, Sigit Leverets is becoming an idol. Not just an idol, but like an idol of such reverence that he wasn't really in his time. He was rather overcast. And what we have now of Leverets is an image, mainly based on this image, and one that I'll show you in a second, of a cigar-smoking man in a black hat who was rarely seen, a master architect, an architect who did not collaborate, an architect who was fundamentally an ego, but who created some rather exceptional, very few, but rather exceptional projects in Sweden. This is another iconic image which builds into this reputation, or I would go as far to say myth, about Sigit Leverets. This is Sigit Leverets on the left, on site at the Church of Klippan, St. Peter's, in the, on the west coast of Sweden. His most important project, I think, in which, so the myth goes, all bricks were handmade and no brick was placed in the building until it had been personally approved by him. And he threw most of them away. He was an obsessive. And if we start to describe him, one of the best descriptions that I've ever heard, very little is written about him, in fact, is by Colin St. John Wilson, the architect who built the British Library in London, a 35-year project, one of the biggest projects in history in London. He described Leverets, he said it was as if he stood at a slight angle to the world. He was obviously in it, but outside of it. And one of the only books of interest written about Leverets, written by Alison and Peter Smithson, who I'm sure we all know, who actually worked on the only real exhibition of Sigit Leverets in history, which happened in 1989 at the AA in London, described him as a silent architect, right? Because he never spoke, he never taught, he never wrote, he was rarely seen in the second half of his life. He just built. That's what he did. That's how he communicated. They said that silent architects, who are defined by what they do rather than by what they say, are by the complexity of invention unaware of doing. And it's at this point in the 80s, and we start to see the myth of Leverets start to be built. But he was a very active person. These are travel snaps from one of his trips to Italy when he was young. Venice, in fact. So you start to see the Palazzo Ducali on the right. You start to see, I don't know, a random campo with a palazzo on the left. He was very deeply affected by classicism in his early days. And if we look at his architecture, we would describe it possibly as an architecture of dignity, as a balance between intimacy, intricacy, grand gesture, of ritual and symbolic form, and really, interestingly, of a conviction of close looking, right? Something that's largely lost. And I say that in a fairly melancholic way, but not totally. But this idea of close looking is largely lost now in architecture. So when ArkDes was invited by Yvonne and Shelley, Grafton Architects, the creative directors of this year's Architecture Biennale in Venice, we're back in Venice again, they wanted Leverets. They wanted to bring Leverets to the Biennale. Has anybody been to this year's Biennale, which closed a few days ago? Yeah, a couple of people. I mean, it's been completely slammed critically, rather unjustly in some ways. People describe it as a Biennale in which taste takes over, right? Which Shirley and Yvonne's taste as architects, and I think that's largely true. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. But of course, we had a little room where we decided to bring together, curatorially speaking, 3 artists, Sigit Leverets being one of them, but really importantly, 2 other living artists, an architect called Petra Gipp, based in Stockholm, and an artist, photographer called Mikael Olsson, also based in Stockholm. So dealing with 3 mediums, the drawing, the model, or the inhabitable model, and the photograph. And then 3 canopies, 3 pieces of Leverets' architecture, 3 unique typologies that are really difficult to even name. Canopies may not even be the right word. And to investigate them closely, to really try to bring in a small part of the Biennale this conviction of close looking back to the fore. So we had 3 canopies from 3 buildings. On the left we have the Resurrection Chapel at Skogsgården, We have in the middle the canopy of St. Mark's Church in Björkhagen outside Stockholm, and on the right we have the canopy of the chapels of St. Knut and St. Gertrude at Östra Kyrkogården in Malmö. We describe these three buildings as representing an architecture experienced as single compound symphonies, and I'll explain why that is in a second. We see these environments, these typologies, these spaces as mediators, as places which create public life between the scales of the landscape of the interior, and ultimately a mediation between landscape and interior. So if I go through very briefly these three projects, because they are so fascinating, and we haven't got nearly enough time to go through them in depth. This is Storkyrkogården, an old photo, the Woodland Cemetery, one of Sweden's only UNESCO World Heritage Sites, a massive burial ground built by Gunnar Asplund and Sigit Leverets, originally together after winning a big competition in the early 1900s. And you can tell a lot about a country or a society by the way they die, by the way they bury people. If you go to the south of Europe, death and burial is deeply symbolic and very almost celebratory, processions and music and wailing. And the further north in Europe you come, the more it's sort of like, oh, what a shame. Shed a tear, put them in the ground, move on. Of course, it's still deeply upsetting and deeply distressing, but different societies handle death in different ways. And the way you spatialize death is really interesting. So when Storkyrkogården was built, also as we're thinking about the early days of the creation of the Swedish state as we know it in the 1930s and 40s, they decided that it would be a pine forest. And in this pine forest, every single tree was marked by an architect. Every single mound was shaped by an architect. And there are three buildings in there. One, from this ancient aerial photograph as well, is the Resurrection Chapel, designed by Sigit Leverets. At the end of an extremely long processional path called the Seven Wells Path, which was originally going to have 7 wells on it, but doesn't. Kilometer long, it's the culmination point of a journey that a body would take. This is the view down that path from within the Resurrection Chapel. And I say it's a pine forest, but actually the trees that line this path are conifers, because conifers are more straighter, so they were able to keep this kind of slice through the landscape more precise. This is a photo taken in the winter 2017-2018 by Mikael Olsson, which was exhibited in the exhibition that we are talking about now. But why are these buildings so important? When I talk about a sensitivity, when I talk about a conviction of close looking, I'm talking about minute gestures. Again, let's be interactive. Do you see anything in this image? This is a photograph that I took looking up from the threshold, from the door entering, the big doors entering the Resurrection Chapel, to look at the canopy and the relationship between the building and the canopy. Do you see anything? It's very subtle. Shout it out if you do. It's difficult to see in this photograph. It's easy to see when you're there. But the canopy is angled by 0.5 degrees away from the building to align with the kilometer-long path. So you can see this slight fissure opening and closing between, because this canopy is a freestanding canopy. It's its own building. Canopies are mostly connected to buildings, right? But these are freestanding objects. A vast canopy, half the size of the building. You look at this fantastic drawing, which was not done by Leverets, but done by a German architect in his office, a draftsman. A beautiful drawing which also shows the relationship between the fact that the building itself, this is not the envelope of the building. The envelope of the building, at the very least, is all of this, and that the most accurate is the entire pine forest. The way it relates to this kilometer along the path, the way it angles, the way that you move into the space are defined by that. The canopy itself was also highly technological at the time, so you will see, for example, if you look at, this is an object that we also have in the exhibition, a postcard, tiny postcard, made by A.B. Ingeberger Kalksten, which is a company that mined limestone, and actually the columns of the canopy of the Resurrection Chapel were the first columns in Sweden to be turned on a single mill, like you would turn a piece of wood on a lathe. So again, highly advanced. When you look at the motifs, the details of these capitals, you start to see things that are not quite, they're not quite classical in the sense that you might understand conventionally. They're ancient Egyptian in their motifs. Leverets never went to Egypt, but he was referencing, he was hunting and gathering from so many different sources that he started to pick and he started to articulate in 1925 a new kind of neoclassicism, a new kind of architecture which started to feed into the idea of the Swedish state. Inside, you see this amazing baldacchino, this amazing canopy in itself, and if you look at the kind of altar piece inside the baldacchino, what you can't see in these images is that it is crimson red. And it looks like something straight out of a kind of 1970s furniture store, but it's made of marble. And his ability, Leverets' ability to be contemporary, right? And what contemporary basically means, as far as I see it, is to be of your time, but completely outside of your time at the same time, right? To be able to reference and project and synthesize together was absolutely astonishing. If we go to the second project, St. Mark's Church in Björkhagen in Stockholm, so a photograph by Mikael Olsson, also in the exhibition. You see on the right here, the canopy that we're talking about, completely different. There are not many drawings of this canopy in the Sigit Leverets archive in ArkDes, because we understand it was a very late edition. So almost like the building was pretty much finished, and then he said, oh, we need a canopy. We need to mediate between the interior and the landscape. He was an architect which designed on site, so a lot of the drawings are missing or post-rationalized. But this canopy itself is in a different context. The scale is lower, the scale is more human, the scale is more attributed to the context of the building, which is in the middle of a suburb in Stockholm, attached to a civic center, made of wood, dealing with iconography and symbolism that you might expect a church to have, the way that the columns and the beams interact and intersect, like the crucifix, but elegant and very deeply related to also the kind of brick vaults that Leverets made in St. Peter's Church and in Klippan, very intricate. And as we move on to Malmö, on the west coast, to Österskyrkogården, to the Eastern Cemetery, we see something completely different. We see, again, similarly to the Resurrection Chapel, vast canopies that are basically completely out of scale with the building size itself. But we see here, this is an image from the ArkDes collections in which you start to see how these, again, are freestanding. They are not directly connected to the building. You start to see here these massive spaces for gathering. Of course, there's a climactic response. I mean, when you're gathering for a funeral, and it's probably going to be snowing, or at the very least raining, and you need to be sheltered. That's one of the fundamental objectives of architecture, of course. But it does something much more symbolic, much more profound than that. So if we jump to Venice, the strange islands where I find myself fairly often, and we look at the kind of exhibition that we started to put together, very, very simple exhibition, as I said, using 3 mediums, 3 formats. When I start to talk about curatorial work in a very simple sense, because this exhibition is completely different in so many ways from the exhibition of Space Popular that I just showed you, but there's a lot that overlaps, spatially, architecturally speaking, using the instruments, which I think are important. And one is context and relationships, which I keep coming back to. Here you can see so many of the photos that Mikael Olsson made, not all were used in the exhibition. And here you see a cast model of the intervention that Petra Gipp made. Spatial inhabitable models, sectional slices of these 3 canopies, abstracted in scale, brought to the same height to be held by the room rather than by themselves. Extremely complex things to make, because in an exhibition, of course, we would have loved to cast these out of concrete, but exhibitions are scenographies on the most part. So we developed a very complex system of concrete, of steel columns, of styrolite, the kind of very dense insulative foam, to create these models. We worked with a bathroom company in Bologna called Oikos to create a new material, which looked somewhere between travertine stone and cast plaster, which was plastered onto these objects in order to give them the sense that they were cast, the sense that they were homogeneous, the sense that they were almost a monopoly of material. And this is what we ended up with. And when you look at this image, you start to see what I mean when I describe held by the room. The models are scaled to the room. There are interventions, there are extensions at the side which kind of anchor it within the space. When you walk into this space, as I described with the Nordic Pavilion, an exhibition has to make its statement instantly, and then it has to be able to unfold. Here the statement was, we're looking at a comparison. We're looking at 3 things together. There are 3 things we're looking at. It's very simple. There are 3 formats, and within that, there are opportunities to engage and unfold. So you started to see, as a visitor, again, this exhibition closed a few days ago, 4 days ago. You start to see here a photograph by Mikael Olsen of the canopy in Malmö through the spatial, the inhabitable model by Petrol. Very, very simple. Here you start to see these three things together, abstracted and altered in order to be seen together. Here you start to see how simple but complex it is to be able to position 2D objects on a wall together to start to make sense as a story. But even the positioning of three photographs can be a very complex discussion in an exhibition which is dealing with conventional formats like this. Here you see, for example, the columns of the Resurrection Chapel through the columns of the Resurrection Chapel, right? These interactions start to take place. What's also important about this view is that you start to see a wonderful photograph by Mikael Olsen here of the Resurrection Chapel and the pine trees around it, because what is a column if it's not a tree trunk, especially a pine tree, where the green starts higher than in other sorts of trees. These interactions, these relationships are really important. Being able to present a medium well, I think one thing that I find very, very interesting is that in architectural exhibitions, photography is very often underrepresented or treated poorly. You know, a photograph, as far as I'm concerned, should never be plastered to a wall. It should be treated with respect, because the medium is very, very important. And within the spaces between Petrogip's models, these niches were created in which we started to express the interior of the Resurrection Chapel. It's super simple, super simple. But what's really important about this exhibition is that it was also using the Biennale as a way to test, as a way to think about how one brings together archival material and contemporary practice. The Biennale should be used as a testing ground. In reality, the Biennale is used as an expo, basically. You know, it's a way to sort of sell. I mean, we were next to, Bjarke Ingels is a wonderful guy, but I mean, his exhibition, which was next door to ours, was basically selling a flood defense project in Manhattan. Interesting. I mean, the room was way busier than our room, but maybe that says something about me. We are working on a massive exhibition that's going to happen on Sigit Leverets, a monumental exhibition that will bring together this architect for the first time, really in history, an enormous book. It's going to hopefully travel the world in 2020. And the exhibition in Venice was a way to present for public scrutiny the ideas that are being developed around that exhibition. That's what exhibitions can do. That's what they're important for. They're important for testing, right? They're important for getting feedback. And like I said, you know, I think it's always important somehow to show that an exhibition, any project, like any architecture project, is an intense collaboration between many people. And although I'm here describing these projects to you, of course, I'm a representative, but I'm not it. There are so many people who have been involved in these sorts of things. And I think if I were to very loosely summarize what I think, what I've been trying to convey, right? And I've read something, I've taken you through different exhibitions. I mean, it's been a bit of a chaotic journey. But at the end of the day, if there was one takeaway that I'm trying to really maybe express from all of this, is that, you know, relationships and context are like really two of the most important things. I get very, very concerned when I go to architecture schools and I hear architects talking about themselves in a way which is deeply unhealthy. Because when we look at the kind of explorations that the people I've been working with have been going into, there's questions of citizenship in virtual environments, all the way from looking at deeply important historical figures and how they relate to us today. We see that kind of a fundamental thread between it all, is that if architecture is the thing which gives form to the values of a society, if it's the thing that presents ideas and makes them last, then it's really one of the most important things that you can do, right? But don't let that translate into an ego, because I think one of the greatest downfalls of so many architects is ego. If you understand that relationships are more important than ego, because they can be reconciled, but they're very hard to, then I think we're all going to be much better for it. And if we think about the practice of architecture not as world building, not as orchestrating space, but creating environments as a result of hunting and gathering, And if I were to really define hunting and gathering for you now, I would say that it's simply about conversation and discussion, of finding things and of understanding and contextualizing. And the reason why I talked about the attention economy is because, obviously, yes, an exhibition is a regime of attention, and we have to guide attention and control attention. But the situation that we all exist in now, in the midst of the attention economy, is that it's very, very, very hard to contextualize. You know, I, as a proponent of the internet, as someone who worked at ArchDaily, I recognize how important ArchDaily is, and I recognize how devastating it has been and could be even more, because not because it's evil, right? Not because it's got bad intentions, it's got very, very good intentions as a company, but because it's operating in a sphere which we are all operating in, and that demands context in order to be overridden. Anyway, I'm going to leave it there because otherwise I'll just keep ranting. And I mean, hopefully this has triggered some questions. I think we have some time maybe for some questions. But thank you very much for giving me your attention for tonight.
Thank you, James, for the attentionable lecture. So it's time for conversation.
Yes.
Starting with questions and
Hi.
Hi.
So you said that the exhibition is basically a space of attention or a space for attention, and you drew kind of a parallel with the casinos. And I started thinking that in some ways it's yes, very similar, but in some ways there is a crucial difference in the sense that in a casino the goal is to get your attention and basically keep it on the slot machines. But in the exhibition, at least nowadays, often the goal is first to get your attention on the objects, but then through these objects to get your attention actually out of that space, either to some global issues or some maybe your inner space of reflecting on your emotions and thoughts and whatever. So in this sense, it's kind of casino is the end point of attention, but the exhibition is more like a portal or a gate of attention to somewhere else. So yeah. Well, so I was wondering, what's your take on it, to have some kind of interesting analysis how to...
Do I have an interesting analysis? Well, the pressure's on now. No, I mean, yes, you're right. Okay, in that sense that there is that in a casino it is the end goal, and an exhibition is a means to an end. But they, you know, most exhibitions. I mean, I don't know about you, but how many exhibitions do you go to where you really remember them, where you really feel like you've been elevated out of a space and allowed to ponder and reflect on global issues, right? There are fundamental flaws, and I'm talking about just about the architecture exhibition here. The architecture exhibition is very hard because you can never recreate a building, right, ever. And that's basically what architecture is. It's very hard to build experience in the way that architecture should be experienced. So you have different tools at your disposal: film, photography, drawings, models, words. All these things can unify to create a regime of attention, and they're all objects. And an exhibition is just warm bodies in a room and cold objects in a room, and an interaction between those two things, you could argue. But my kind of interesting analysis on your comment is maybe not so interesting. I just think that many exhibitions are really bad. And in order to be able, it's because they're challenging, and in order to sort of reconcile all of these major questions, because the expectation is, I think, in an art exhibition, your expectation is to see some nice art, and maybe you're not being required to form an opinion on that. You're more being taken around a curatorial narrative or a story. And that's that. Now, architecture exhibitions, visitors to architecture exhibitions, on the whole, expect to be given knowledge, expect to be given experience, and maybe expect to have their view of the world changed or altered slightly, which is a massive task. Massive, massive task. And so in the sense of the parallel between a casino and an exhibition in its conventional sense, like an exhibition in a museum, for instance, because there are so many other interesting forms of exhibition, would simply be to say that on a very superficial level, they are both regimes of attention, which have different outcomes potentially, but they both should use spatial techniques, and they both do use very similar spatial techniques in order to orchestrate that attention. And if you deny that, you are, I think, as a curator, as an exhibition designer, you are fundamentally flawed. Does that answer the question at all?
Partly, but what would be the different part compared to casino when you don't want to just get your attention on the objects, but then to get it to move on to somewhere else? How do you achieve that? Is that automatic, or do you do something special for
I think it's totally dependent. I don't think there's not like a magic key which unlocks it. It's about really understanding. I mean, if I take the Space Popular exhibition that I showed you earlier, this was a very intense environment, right, in terms of color, in terms of image. You put a VR headset in the middle of a room, people just go straight for the VR headset. Right, there's a novelty about this technology which is bizarre, because for most people, I think, they think that VR is 20 years ahead of where the technology actually is. But there's a novelty about an object, a single object, which pulls the attention, which completely absorbs it. If there wasn't a VR headset, which denotes an experience, an immersive experience, if there wasn't a VR headset in that space, maybe people would come in and stop at the first fabric and look at it and move on to the next one. Who knows? The way that people move in exhibitions is a fascinating study in itself. But it's a very simple orchestration technique. By simply having an object, by including an object, by excluding an object, you can define whole narratives. And the way that people understand or read an exhibition is really a spatial question. It's an architect's question. It's about understanding how movement happens. So in a very simple way, I would say that there is a fundamental difference, but you've answered the question yourself, is the end goal. But there's so many similarities between understanding how these two environments merge. Exhibitions in casinos are the future.
Great, thanks.
No?
Yeah, there will be.
I was quite intrigued by your statement that the way how architects work nowadays is completely outdated, and just because we don't see the space with the materials in real time. That I'm wondering why you state that and where your observations are coming from, because I think the real time or the materiality or whatever kind of colorful images that we're often producing those for clients or people who don't read space or who can't imagine space, who are not been trained for 5 years with certain spatial intelligence, or who actually is more interested of understanding the geometry, the interrelationships between those. And I'm wondering why you say that.
A few things I'll unpick in that. One is, I think to say that people don't have spatial intelligence is again, maybe a facet of this question of the ego of the architectural education, right? Because, and that's probably why I read that chapter. I'm not saying you have an ego, I'm saying that everybody, all architects do. Because when you read something like this, and you think about someone who's not an architect and the way that they describe space. Space is attached to atmosphere, space is attached to movement, space is, I think someone like Durga Chubose has a phenomenal spatial intelligence, which he articulates in this book. So I think that's maybe the first thing I just want to unpick. The second thing is that I wasn't necessarily saying that architects are outdated, using outdated methods or whatever, outdated themselves in practice because of that. I think what I'm really trying to say is that architecture is an insular world, right? It's quite an insular world. I mean, this school is unique because it's at least in a building now with other disciplines, and that's a majorly important thing. But when I say architects should become cognitive scientists, when I say architects should be sociologists, obviously that's not realistic, but there needs to be an understanding, there needs to be a growing understanding beyond the perceived boundaries or limits of the practice. Because only then can we actually start to deal with these problems. I mean, Space Popular, as I said, run Intermediate Unit 1, Studio 1 at the AA, in which they are quite radical with their teaching techniques, where students really are designing through gaming engines, which render in real time. They are experiencing space through VR headsets in real time. Therefore, do they need to draw? Do they need to physically model? Not really. Right? That's one extreme. But in this, when you start to think about this context, that statement comes from the idea of, if you think about the technology, like the kind of software that the gaming industry is using, which is represented by that exhibition that I showed you, highly, like, way more advanced technology than you would find on most laptops or computers in an architectural practice, you realize that, like, it may not be the tool, but it's a tool. And why is architecture why is architecture so insular? Because architecture is relationships, architecture is building, as I've repeatedly said. And I really start to wonder why, in some cases, not all, architects are not what people think they are, which are essentially highly engaged with every kind of, obviously, politics, but giving more deeply into other disciplines. Because if you're thinking about virtual reality, to pick up on that thread, the reason why Space Popular argue that we should be more perceptive, we should understand cognitive science, is because when you're dealing with building or designing or creating livable spaces in virtual environments, you really don't have to think about temperature, you don't have to think about light, you don't have to think about material in a conventional sense, but you have to think about how the human eye works. Right? You have to think about how things start to relate and augment, how things start to build and layer upon, in an augmented environment, the physical world around us and the virtual world. So I'm not sure, I mean, I'm ranting again, but I feel like maybe that's the point I was trying to make, rather than to say that architects are outdated because of their tools. I think there's so much to enrich architecture, but the insularity of the practice is really what I am realizing after not being an architect anymore, as in the conventional sense, but practicing architecture in a curatorial position, in which suddenly you're dealing with something completely different. Is anybody really angry? Are you angry? I'm not angry. Oh, good. It's like, someone's angry down here.
You mentioned the term livable spaces. What do you think in the future, architecture, should it ask for more attention, or actually it should reserve our attention for other things because there's so much information around?
Architecture is the practice of peripheral attention, right? What I mean by that is that architecture hasn't really moved forward very, very quickly in the last 1,000 years. The reason why you could argue that door is that size, is so that you don't have to think about it when you walk through it, right? It's the size of an average human. So that makes it peripheral. That makes it peripheral to our attention. Rooms, the way that this room is orchestrated, in terms of the lighting, in terms of the design of the chair, in terms of this, relationship between you and I, which is extremely ancient. I'm down here standing and you're sat there looking and that kind of thing. These are all here to try to make, in many ways, the architecture as background as possible, right? Architecture essentially is the practice of putting things at the edge of our understanding. And then, of course, architecture has moments where it shouts and where it's loud. And that can be take a sacred building like a Catholic church, in which the door is enormous and it's colorful and it's a space which is designed to heighten a feeling. But on the most part, architecture and the instruments of architecture that form, or the components, that form a building, are designed to be at the edge. Now, if I were to speculate about, especially in relation to, by the way, virtual reality is a completely outdated term in itself. Augmented reality is too. People are really using the words mixed reality or X reality now to describe this fusion between physical and virtual. If I were to speculate on that, and this is highly biased by the conversations that I've been having in relation to the exhibition that I showed you, I would say that we are going to be existing in a situation in the next 20 years in which there is a virtual layer between our eyes and potentially other senses and the physical, tactile world around us. Now, has anyone seen Ghost in the Shell, the remake? Has anyone seen the new Blade Runner film? Right? Has anyone seen anyway, no, those two are important. Those two films give us visions of urban environments in which there is an augmented interface. You know, and we really can't disparage pop culture, just as we shouldn't disparage science fiction. Like, if you do ever have the chance to read Pygmalion Spectacles, the book that I mentioned earlier, you will see how unbelievably bizarre it is to read a book from 1935 in 2018 and see how unbelievably prophetic it was. And when we look at, you know, because architecture is slow, which is its benefit and its curse, you start to realize that architecture will slowly start to respond to this. And if we look at these films created by artists and architects, I mean, in Blade Runner, the new Blade Runner film, the house, I wasn't really focusing when I watched it, so I can't name any of the characters' names or anything, but there is a building which is like the evil corporation owner lives in, his office, was actually the company, the studio commissioned an architect to design those spaces, right? Which were never going to be built, but just to design for the film. So even then, that's the creation of a virtual livable environment, as far as I'm concerned. So we're transitioning, and in that context, we will see, in relation to attention and the attention economy, what Ghost in the Shell represents, what Blade Runner, and what many other kind of prophetic things from pop culture show, and what logic also, I think, would lead us to believe, is that this will become not a territory necessarily in which we start to see beautiful layered interfaces between, in which we start to see the visions of a world that Space Popular described, but basically we see advertising. And we see something a little bit more crude. These technologies exist. Stockholm is actually a world leader in VR technology. It's kind of like the Silicon Valley of the North, without the sun. In Stockholm, there are technologies being created which are now being funded by militaries around the world. There are technologies, I take one company, Tobii, who have created the world's most advanced eye tracker, which is a device that looks like a pair of glasses, a normal pair of glasses, which can track in real time where your pupil is looking around. Now, this technology is so interesting and has so many interesting possibilities in relation to creating virtually augmented environments, but it will probably, dare I say, and hopefully not, be bought by Google or Amazon, or a company that we can't even contemplate now, and will be utilized in a very different way to make money, because that's the structure of the attention economy. So maybe, this is a very long-winded answer, but the crux of it is that there is no role for the architect or the designer in this world that's coming, that's impending, that's happening anyway, unless architects and designers make a role themselves. I mentioned earlier The Sims, I mentioned Minecraft. If you've ever played these games, you'll know that anybody without any kind of architectural training or spatial understanding can simply put blocks together. And when you go into Sansar, when you go into Steam, these virtual reality platforms now, you see phenomenally interesting chaotic environments which are built by anybody outside of the realm of any kind of need to understand the effects of gravity or understand the effects of how sunlight enters a space, because all those concerns are completely irrelevant. So how we start to, I believe that architects need to engage with this in order to understand what the role could be, what the role should be. Because if we are going to spend all of our time either in completely immersive virtual environments or more likely in virtually augmented environments, that is, all the environments we spend our time in now, but with an interface, they should be livable. They should be designed with the values and the skills that an architect has. But that's not certain.
Yeah, thank you for the inspiring lecture, but I would ask to continue this same topic, that what will you say if we get tired of this, or what happens if you, as a curator, for example, what would you offer then if I refuse to use this technology. I mean, when I go to an exhibition, would I like to continue living in this same virtual reality, then maybe I would choose the reality instead. And what happens then? Like, is there anything new to be offered?
In the sense of?
In the sense of just reality without the augmentation.
Well, no, reality's great. Reality's awesome, right? But, okay, so one of the most important parts of that exhibition was to be able to basically emphasize the physical environment over the virtual. So if you look at the kind of the setting which was created, God, I made a lot of slides. If you look at the setting which was created, there is the fact that the technology is absolutely, there we are. The technology is absolutely, is not there, right? The technology is extremely outdated, right, already. So in terms of the VR headset, which is a HTC Vive that we use in this exhibition, became outdated during the course of the exhibition. But that is a representation of how that technology is accelerating. The technology is clumsy. The technology breaks. The technology, why would we have this in our homes? It's too expensive, and we haven't got time to deal with it. But as it becomes more accessible and more available, then it's going to be out of our hands. We will have to see what happens. But if you take social media I would describe social media as a movement as well as a technology. 30 years ago, to have a public opinion, you had to have a newspaper column, basically. Now, you just have to have someone retweet a tweet, and that becomes a public opinion. It can take on waves. The idea of virality is not a new concept, but one that's taken on new meaning in social media. So when you think about this, what we're dealing with is what I think we all maybe understand, is that the technology that social media has brought is not totally beneficial. It is beneficial in so many ways, in connecting and democratizing, but it's not so beneficial as we see in elections around the world. What this represents to me is the fact that we have an amazing ability collectively to blindly walk into things, which then we realize a little bit too late that that was maybe a mistake, or we should have had at least one ethical conversation between the people who made this technology and whatever. We're at a possibility now with virtual reality to have that ethical conversation. And again, I'm using virtual reality in using that word because that's what makes sense to us, but it's going to be more than that. It's going to be much more nuanced, much more available, much more accessible. It's not going to replace the physical world. Virtual reality to most means entering into a completely self-enclosed virtual environment. That's already an old concept. It's what happened in this exhibition, but it's already old. It's going to be the relationship between the physical, the real, and the non-physical, but also the real, right? The relationships that you build between people through chat rooms in the early 2000s, that you will make as avatars in virtually augmented environments, are just as real as the relationship between you and I right now as we talk across this room. We have to start to think about it in slightly different ways, but I think we have to have an understanding collectively about what the ethical dilemmas are. When I talk about attention and advertising, that's one such one. When I talk about architects and whether these environments should be livable and designed, that's another one. There are many, many, many more. But of course, I don't think there will be any requirement to engage with this technology. You could keep yourself firmly planted in the real world and live your life. But what I think we know about social media today is that it's more dangerous for you to be not involved than it is for you to be involved, right? Deleting your Facebook account is a very stupid thing to do. Very stupid. Because if you still have your Facebook account, you have control over that data. As soon as you delete it, it doesn't delete the data. It doesn't delete the personal information. Facebook, if you give it no data, just by your interactions, it can tell your gender, it can tell your sexual orientation, it can work out who's your best friend, who's your worst friend. It knows who you stalk. All of this builds an image of you, which is sometimes wrong, but largely correct. So this is kind of the big question we're going to have to face. Do we want to step out of this technology or refuse to engage with it? That's perfectly valid. Or is it better to be a part of it and to shape its direction? Because if I were to be very clear from my position right now, and we can all meet up in 40 years' time if we're all still alive, and and see whether I'm right, but maybe I'm totally wrong. But what is going to happen with mixed reality is going to be way bigger than social media has been. It's going to be way more infiltrated into the way that we live our lives. It's going to be way more immersive. It's going to be much, much harder to say no to than social media is. You know, you don't have to have a Twitter account to survive in the world. But when we start to look at the way China is going as a government through social media for social ratings, you know, I don't know whether you've heard of this, but through Weibo, WeChat, one of the most invasive forms of government-controlled social media in the world, you are now, citizens in Beijing are now receiving trials for social rankings, in which if you miss a payment, if you are late to collect the food that you ordered and from the equivalent of Uber Eats, if you, basically, what they deem as bad conduct or good conduct, you get a ranking. You're either 5 stars or you're 1 star. If you're less than 2 stars, you can't get a flight. You can't buy a flight ticket. You can't get on a train that goes for more than an hour. So the power of this technology is not a fallacy. The power that this technology can have massive impacts on the way that we live. And so my simple answer after a very long rant would be to simply say that, yes, would be perfectly valid to ignore this, but it would be maybe more intelligent to not. And even if you think it's terrible and disastrous, is to be able to be involved in order to express that opinion. That is what I hope we will, all of us, as collectively, will understand from the last 10 years, right? The internet's basically been around as we know it in terms of the World Wide Web for 10 years. It's like the absolute fraction of time in terms of the history of technology and mankind. And if we look at that bell curve, you know, we start to see how things are accelerating. The acceleration is going to happen very quickly. As I mentioned about the Oculus Quest, this new VR device, people are going to buy this in hundreds of thousands, if not millions, because it's cheap and it's novel and it means something. Just like we all, when we first saw the iPhone, we were like, oh my God, that's expensive, and who needs an iPhone? I've got a BlackBerry. And now, you know, if you don't have an iPhone, you are the major exception to the rule. And if we look at an iPhone, these will be remembered as some of the golden ages of our time, because everything is bound by a screen. What we're about to see is the content imbued in this, the data bleed out. And that bleed will be into our urban environments, into the thing that gives shape to our society, which is architecture. So that is the logical thing to me. And I mean, the days of being able to just like turn off the screen and like leave it alone for an hour are going to be, we're going to, you know, sit around the campfires after the nuclear holocaust going, oh, remember those days? You know, so I mean, it's a very long-winded answer, but like it's a position that I have based on many assumptions, right? I'm not trying to espouse like the fact or the truth or how it's going to be. This is what I see. This is what I see when I start to look at technology through the lens of design and society.
I still try to imagine seeing Leverets exhibition.
Yeah, that would be fun, wouldn't it? Yeah. Yeah, exactly. But I mean, you know, the thing is, also, when I talk about casinos, I'm not saying it's bad architecture. I'm saying it's some of the best architecture that's ever been made. Like, incredibly powerful, like all-encompassing architecture, which deals with the senses, which deals with movement, which, you know, in a rather sophisticated way, keeps you boxed in and basically tells you how to perform in an environment, gives you the illusion of freedom, right? Which is the kind of the great trick of you know, some of the most wonderful mosques and basilicas in the world. Just give you the illusion of freedom. But actually, you're highly orchestrated in these environments. So I mean, yeah, I don't know. Maybe I spoke too soon to say that casinos and architecture exhibitions should merge. But
another question: why is Leverets so popular?
Yeah, well, that is the mystery. It's not a mystery in the sense that I think he is an extremely important practitioner. And I mean, if you ever do get the chance to take the party boat over to Stockholm, and and see some of these buildings. Mainly, some of the most interesting ones are around Stockholm. The others are on the west coast. Klippan is very, very hard to get to. You need a car. But Malmö, the Eastern Cemetery, is very easy to get to from the city. Just to understand something which is largely lost in contemporary architecture, which is the understanding, as I outlined, that the boundaries of a building, the envelope of a building, is much broader than, the front door, right? Is that how architecture relates to, again, mediates between the idea of the interior and landscape, whether that landscape be a forest or a city. It's something really, really important. And there obviously are architects that do this. Grafton architects who create the Biennale are very, very good at that. There are entire schools of architects who are very interested in this, but the resurgence of interest in Leverets is kind of a mystery, but I think the myth around him is so strong that what the curators and at the museum who are dealing with the collection, the Sigit Leverets collection in ArkDes now, are really trying to do is tell a new story in 2020. Not a new story in the sense of disregarding this myth, but trying not to build the myth. It's impossible to dismantle the myth, but show that if you go back to the 20s and 30s, Sigit Leverets was an extremely active person in politics, in society. Later in his life, he became slightly more introverted, but not totally introverted. There's a new story to tell, and I think that story will start to maybe answer some of the questions about why Leverets is so interesting, because he was multi-talented. He had a company in which he designed door handles and window fixtures called Idesta. He was not just an architect, he was an obsessive designer in many senses. And I swear, the myth around Sigit Leverets, the fascination, is based on the absence of information. No? The less information you have about someone, the more enigmatic they are, and the more powerful the idea of them becomes. So that's what we're sort of challenged now, and that would basically be why I think there is this resurgent interest, because the myth is so powerful.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.